Hello there, we're back. It's more US history. Now we are going to look at chapter 3, which is going to help you answer the rest of the assignment questions for unit 2, which covers chapter 2 and chapter 3. The chapter 2 video should be up. You can watch it and hopefully it will help you answer the questions. And this will be the chapter 3 one. So again, let's share our screen. We want to share everything, and it's going to look a little strange in the beginning. There it is, very odd, right? But we are going to go up here to first, so we know where we are. Unit 2, assignments. You have 2 assignments for Unit 2. You have the fill in the blanks, and then you have your notebooks, which, like I said, I will do a separate video to help you answer these notebook questions. Remember, by the way, that I put it on full screen. Let's put it on full screen so it's easier for you to see. History Notebook Part 2. You cannot do History Notebook Part 2 if you have not completed History Notebook Part 1. Okay, so you need to do Part 1 to get to Part 2. Do not fall behind, or it's going to be so much work for you. And we'll get into this in another video, but these are your required notes, and then these are your student chosen notes. So while I am talking, if you want to take down your own notes, you should have a little page open, maybe like this. And I took very few notes, so I know that you will make much better notes than me. You can have your notes for chapter 3 open so that when you hand in your journal, you will have all of that. But if you do not want to do notes like that, you can also do the little graphic organizers, and we will get into that the next chapter. But right now we have these questions that we need to answer. So let's get into the ebook and see if we can find the answers to some of these questions. Now, here's a little bit of a tip for you. Not all the questions are in the ebook or are very easy to find. So sometimes you're going to have to Google some of these answers, and I will show you how to do that. I'm not going to give you the answers, but I will show you how to Google the answers so that you can find them, because they're not always very clear in the book. So I'm sorry. First, let's get here. You can listen to this little audio.
Industrialization.
Now, I'm not sure if that audio picked up, but remember, guys, you can listen to the ebook. So if it's a little difficult for you to read, you can always just press play. And it's much shorter than my version. So um, if you want to, you can press play. But here we start with a picture of Andrew Carnegie, who founded Carnegie Steel. And he's one of the great businessmen, the tycoons of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. He became a multimillionaire and employed a whole lot of people. And this is where America starts moving into more of an industrial society rather than an agricultural one. In here in the map, you can see that we're going to go from 1865 all the way to 1900. You have the red there. You have some of the railways across America and the movement of people across America, and you know, the expansion. Okay, transcontinental rail lines. So transcontinental means that it traverses, goes across the entire continent. So remember that vocabulary for quizzes and tests. And don't forget, guys, I'm going to show this again in case you didn't watch the first video. When you go into your grades, you'll see all the assignments that you have and you go, oh my God, it's so many. But a lot of these are quizzes, okay? Just do the quizzes. The ones that are longer, and it's the ones that we're really studying more in class, are the short answer ones, like they analyze a historical document and things like that. And you can work that with me, okay? And by the way, on Tuesday, at class time, I will be on live. So if anybody has any questions, you can sign on with me live on YouTube and we can talk US history. So if you have any questions at all, or you can email me, always you can email me, okay? So let's get to it. I'm going to close this right here. This is from the last video, but I'm going to leave a Google page open. So let's go google.com right there, okay? Because sometimes we're going to have to look at Google. So always check out your vocabulary. Let's focus on what is the gross national product, what is an entrepreneur, and what is laissez-faire. And then you have some academic vocabulary, like what are resources and practice. We'll look at that, okay? Don't forget your reading strategies. If you do need to take your own personal notes, if you don't want to write down notes, or the required notes. So that's where you'll find that. And always remember that you can listen to the chapter if you want to. So the essential question here, or the guiding question, is why was the United States so successful at industrialization? So let's look at our list of questions. We answered that one, we answered that one, and we answered that one. So let's focus on what were two significant factors in the growth of the US industry, okay? And these pretty much go in the order that we read them. So as we reach them, we should be able to find them. So first, we understand that industry really expanded, okay? And a lot of Americans left the farm to work in the mines and factories, okay? Because they found gold, they found minerals that could make a lot of money. And so the United States, the gross national product, which is the total value of goods that a country produces in a year, was 3 times bigger by the 1860s. So if you want to, I would put that down as a note, right? Gross national product is important vocabulary. Take down your own notes, of course, in your own words, but it's always good to have vocabulary. So what is a natural resource? Okay, a natural resource is something that you can get from the earth that you can use to make other things. So some of the natural resources in America are timber, which are trees, right? Coal, which you can use to run the railway, the railroads. Iron, which helps you make things like the railway. So iron is very interesting. Copper, which we'll find out later, is good for electrics things. So because America had these already in the country, they didn't need to import them. And a lot of these resources were in the American West. So this helped accelerate the industrialization, okay, as well as the Transcontinental Railroad helped this. So if you were paying attention right now, as I spoke, you will see that you have the answer to maybe this question, okay? So I'm gonna cross that one out. Let's see who was paying attention in the video class. By the way, there's a nice little video here on Thomas Edison and how it is that he brought electricity to New York City. So moving ahead, there was another resource, petroleum. And what was petroleum good for? Okay, because it turned into kerosene. And the American oil industry was built on this because kerosene was used for lanterns and stoves. Remember, this was before electricity, okay? So oil was very important to light things. So if you have a kerosene lamp, is this right there. So before electricity, this is what people used. Okay, so this was very important. And kerosene used for what? What else was kerosene used for? Solvent, pesticides, heating oil. Okay, so you can have a kerosene stove in order to cook. Okay, or even to heat your house. So kerosene was a very important resource at that time. So this oil production rose and it fueled economic expansion. And also another resource that we have is humans. Okay, there were a lot of people and they were all going out west. And look at that. Between 1860 and 1910, the population of the US tripled, 3 times as big. So this gave a lot of people. This gave a lot of people to be able to work in these industries. Okay, there was a lot of workforce there. And how did this population grow? One is because people had large families, and the other is immigrants. Okay, so people came from Europe and China and other places. Okay, so between 1870 and 1910, more than 17 million immigrants arrived in the United States. So we had natural resources, a lot of them, and a growing workforce. These are two significant factors. And remember, a lot of these questions that are here can also be found there. And remember to always put these answers in your own words. Okay? So let's talk about inventions. What inventions from this period had the most impact on daily life, which I believe is this, but you can, this question here is kind of your own idea. Okay, we're going to look at a lot of inventions and then you can answer this question with your own thoughts. Which one do you think had the most lasting influence, meaning it it changed the way of America for the longest time? Well, first, of course, is electricity, and you've probably studied about Thomas Edison in your Brazilian curriculum. He uh, he actually had a lot of inventions. First was the phonograph. Okay, the phonograph. If you don't know what that is, I'll show you. Maybe some of your parents had phonographs or grandparents. This is a phonograph. So you can listen to music. This is the before the iPod and before Spotify. You had the phonograph, and then he had the electric generator, and then the light bulb. So the electric generator is another important invention, right? So remember, in that question, you can answer any way that you want. You can pick what you think was the invention that had the most. So this is an electric generation from now. But let's look at the Edison electric generator. Wow. Okay, so what does an electric generator do? Uh, it generates power. Okay, it allows for there to be power. And he also had the battery, the motion picture. Okay, and he also was able to make light bulbs. By the way, what is a light bulb? Maybe you don't know this vocabulary, so let's look it up. What is a light bulb? That's a light bulb. Okay, so Edison was the man. Okay, so he created many, many, many things, and his companies merged to create the Edison General Electric Company, which today is known as GE, the GE light bulb. So you see that Edison himself had lasting impact because his company still exists. So then this electricity revolution took a step forward when George Westinghouse developed the alternating current AC to distribute electricity over long distance using transformers and generators. So now electricity began to improve living standards because now we had lights on the streets, electric trolley cars that could take people to work much faster, and they AC currents are still used today. Okay, so if you want to take some notes, maybe take a few notes based on that right there. Oh, sorry about that, guys. Anyway, so yes, electricity definitely, and how to manage electricity are two very important things that happen around this time. And the next big step is the telephone. Okay, and this is by Alexander Graham Bell. Bell is a telephone guy. Edison is the electricity guy. Westinghouse is the AC guy. So maybe for your notes, so that you know who everybody is, you want to put here Thomas Edison. And then I already forgot his first name, George Westinghouse. Westinghouse. And then finally, we have Alexander Graham Bell. And then you want to maybe put who were these guys? What did they invent? Why were they important after that? So you have an idea of who these people were. So he created a telephone. And of course, this helped a lot because now family could get in touch with each other easier. Businesses could place orders more quickly because before they had to send it by mail. So imagine if I wanted to buy something in a store that was in New York City, I would have to send, and I live in Florida, I have to send a mail, on a horse maybe. And it would take a long time to get to New York to then come back to me. But now I could call, okay? And eventually his company became American Telephone and Telegraph Company, which is AT&T, which guess what? Also still exists today. AT&T is still a company today. So you see how these three men definitely had lasting impact. So pick one of these and see which one you think is the best. But we have more, okay? Another important, guys, is Thaddeus Lowe. He invented the ice making machine. So why do you think ice making is important? Anybody know why ice making is important? Well, if you have food, it can save that food for longer, especially meat, right? Because some food can last for a very long time, and others can't. So you need something to refrigerate them. Before this, people would use a lot of salt, but with refrigeration, you could load fresh meat into the railway. It could be shipped long distance. So because of this, the price of food began to drop because it became easier to transport food, right? Meat, especially. When it's more difficult to transport meat, it's more expensive because you're paying for the extra work that it takes to transport it. So all this innovation continued. We had Christopher Scholes. So if you want to write his name down here, you can. And it says that he invented the typewriter. And then who else? I'm not going to write all of them. So you'd be a good student there at home. You can talk about Josephine Cochran, the automatic dishwasher. That's the machine to wash your dishes. George Eastman, the first handheld camera, the Kodak camera. Frank and Charles Duryea built the first gasoline-powered carriage. Uh-oh, we're getting almost to cars here, okay? Power-driven sewing machines and cloth cutters rapidly moved the clothing business, okay? A sewing machine is to make clothes. Large factories began using these new processes and inventions to mass produce shoes. Because imagine before you would have to make a shoe by hand. And now all of a sudden you had factory sewing machines. And look at that, right? So these factory sewing machines, you're able to make things much, 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 much faster and make them in mass production. As you can see, a bunch of people here working at their sewing machines. So here, if you read the rest of this chapter, the rest of this paragraph, you can get some more inventions, and there's a question that was on the assignment, the same question, okay? So let's continue. Now, here is an important word for you guys, laissez-faire. We're going to get into that in a second. What is laissez-faire? But before we get into laissez-faire, we need to understand the American economic system. It's a free enterprise system. So a free enterprise system is where entrepreneurs are people who risk their capital in organizing and running a business, believe they could make money in manufacturing and transportation. So what is free enterprise? Let's just double check to make sure we know what is free enterprise. Free enterprise definition. And you go. The government places very few restrictions on the type of business activities or ownership that citizens want to engage in, okay? And that's going to connect to laissez-faire. So maybe you want to put there free enterprise and put the definition, and also entrepreneur. Let me see if I spelled that right. Did I spell it right? I don't think I did. It's a French word. Entrepreneur. Look at me. I think I did it wrong. But anyway, let's put the definition of an entrepreneur right there. And I think that'll be better. Okay? People who risk their capital. What is capital? Their money or property. Okay, so if I want to start a business, I'm going to get my money and I'm going to try to start this business and see if I make money starting this business. Okay, it's a risk. And these new inventions transform society. These new inventions that transform society would not have been possible if people didn't invest in them. And guess what happens when you invest in something? You actually get to be rich if that idea is a good idea. But you can also lose money if your idea is not a good idea. So America supported laissez-faire, and it's a French word. See a lot of French in US, in the American language, or the English language, sorry. And laissez-faire means let people do what they want, okay? Let people do what they choose in business. So That's why I told you that laissez-faire is connected to free enterprise, because it basically says, let, okay, um, in this, oops, let's take that out. In this system, the government does not interfere that much in business. And business people are free to make all the money they want. Now, you'll see that this creates a little bit of a problem in a little bit. It seems really good, and in some ways it is, but it can create some problems. And some people will disagree with laissez-faire and say that it's not the best system. We will get into that in a little bit. Laissez-faire relies on supply and demand rather than the government to regulate wages and prices. So they believe that the free market works because of competition. Now, you can ask Ms. Summer about this in your economics class if you have economics with her. Laissez-faire advocates low taxes and limited government. So basically, listen, I'm going to create a product. You can create a product. If my product is better than your product, I'm going to make more money, and you're not. That's laissez-faire. And the government is going to put very low taxes so that it's easy for me to make this product, and it's easy for you too. So let the best man or best woman win. This is different than if the government is regulating and saying, okay, all the chocolates have to be 10 reais, or no chocolate can be more than 20 reais, because everybody loves chocolate and everybody needs to have chocolate. This is not laissez-faire. Okay? Laissez-faire is, hey, I went all the way to India to get the best cacao to make chocolate. So I am going to make my chocolate more expensive than your chocolate, which comes from a little city in Brazil. Okay? Or maybe I would go to Sweden to get the best chocolate. I don't know. So you can kind of see what do you think is the best system. But you need to understand both of them, because this is going to be important for US history. Because what is the government's relationship to business? In the 1800s, the US was very much into the laissez-faire. The taxes were low, also spending was low. There wasn't a lot of regulation on industry, so the government didn't control wages and prices. What does that mean? The government didn't control how much the company would give to its workers. So if I have a company and I want to pay you 5 reais, I can pay you 5 reais because I think that's what you're worth. So yes, the United States is one of the largest free trade areas in the world too. This is very important. Unlike Europe, which was divided into dozens of countries, each with tariffs, the entire United States was open to trade. So the US did not, the Constitution bans a state from imposing tariffs. What does that mean? If I live in the state of California and I want to sell something to the state of Texas, there's not a tax for that, okay? And supporters of laissez-faire said that these factors played a major role in the economic growth of the country, which, by the way, if you are following along, I believe that's the answer to that question. Okay, so just keep that in mind. There are 2 assignments. This one, sometimes you have to look on Google to find a few of these answers, but some of them are in the book. So, how else did the government help promote business? Well, northern leaders wanted high tariffs to protect manufacturers from foreign competition and supported federal subsidies for companies building roads, canals, and railroads. Southern leaders opposed subsidies and favored low tariffs to promote trade. So here we have a little bit of debate, okay? This is before the Civil War. The North says, hey, we should really have tariffs on foreign products so we can protect the American products. This is nationalist, okay? And we should also have help from the government to build roads, to build railroads, to build things that people can't build in the private sector. The Southerners were against this. We had a civil war. Who won the Civil War, guys? The North. So after the Southern states seceded, the Republican-controlled Congress passed the Morrill Tariff, greatly increasing tariff rates. So in 1865's tariffs tripled, and Congress gave a whole bunch of land to the West, $65 million for them to create railroads. They sold public lands and mineral resources. And there's a debate on whether these were the policies that helped the economy grow. So just to review, before the Civil War, remember, a lot of the Civil War was fought because the Civil War wanted, the South wanted more state rights. Okay, the South wanted state rights. I'm gonna write this here. So the South wanted more state rights, less tariffs, less government money for public. Well, no, I'm not gonna say for public. For construction of infrastructure. The South wanted higher tariffs. Guys, a tariff is a tax, okay, on foreign goods. And they wanted more money for construction of infrastructure. My spell check is not working for some reason. Let's see here. There you go. Tariffs. Okay. Always use spell check, guys. And if you are paying attention, you will see that Mr. Ray wrote the South 2 times, but I fixed it. So the North won the Civil War. So this is what happens. Okay, this is what happened. They passed that bill, which was called the Morrill Tariff. Okay. Let's put that down. So if you want to put that in some of your notes, increase tariffs by 3 times, right? If I remember correctly, said by 3 times. And they also spent $65 million on getting the railroads built. But what's the problem? High tariffs contradicted laissez-faire ideas. Okay? So why? Because if you raise tariffs on foreign goods, other countries raise tariffs on American goods. And this could hurt American companies, especially farmers. Guess what, guys? This is exactly what's happening today because Donald Trump believes in this. He's in a trade war with China. And he wants to, in his ideology, his belief is to make American goods better. Make America great, right? So buy more American goods. So we're going to make it very expensive to buy things from China because we want Americans to buy from Americans. But the problem is, China then raises the taxes on American goods that go to China. And this makes it very difficult, especially for agriculture. And Trump has had to help farmers because of this, send money to farmers. So this is stuff that's so old, but it's still something that's happening today. And in fact, in Brazil, it's something that happens because there is this battle between more nationalistic trade policy and more global trade policy that you can see even in Brazil. So anyway, this helped American companies trying to sell goods abroad. Despite these problems, many business leaders and members of Congress believed the tariffs were necessary because they didn't think that American industries could compete with the established European factories. But once the fact American companies became very large and efficient, business leaders began to push for free trade because they said, hey, we want to compete internationally. So, how did laissez faire economies encourage businesses to industrialize? Well, it meant that businesses could adapt, businesses could do whatever they needed to do in order to make money. Let's see if that's one of our questions. Oh, what do you know? Okay. So that's how laissez faire encouraged businesses to industrialize because business people were free to invest and put money in new technologies and see what would work. So that's the answer to that. And look at that, we are finished. Lesson one. There's some review questions, which are always important. What is the most important cause of the American industrialization? Why was America successful in it? What inventions had the most impact? How did laissez faire economics promote industrialization? Let's move ahead to lesson two. Again, you can listen to lesson two if you don't want to hear my voice. How did the United States become an industrialized society after the Civil War? How did the Transcontinental Railroad transform the West? Let's make sure that, oh, look at that. It's the next question. Okay, so let's pay attention to that to see if we can find the right answer. And it should be right under, okay? In 1865, the US had about 35,000 miles of railroad. After the Civil War, it expanded dramatically, and the US had more than 200,000 miles of track. And we saw that already in the first map. I don't think there's a second map here that shows how much of the of America was under the railroad, but it was a lot. It was a lot. The Transcontinental Railroad. We saw that in the first map. So the railroad boom, there's that word again, the explosion, began with the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. So maybe that's something for your notes. And what did this act do? It gave two corporations, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, permission to build transcontinental railroads. So these two railroads are very important. Okay, so if you go here, Transcontinental Railroad, and you have the Union Pacific Union and Central Pacific. These are the two main railroads, and you can see there where they go and where that goes. Okay, and they began building the first transcontinental railroad which connects all the way to California. So that's very important. There's another map. Okay, these are two railway companies, but they connected, and it allowed for goods to come all the way across. So it says here that it was under the direction of engineer Greenville Dodge. Okay, the Union Railroad began pushing westward from Omaha, Nebraska. We saw that on the map. And then the Central Railroad was the dream of Theodore Judah. Again, maybe you want to write these notes down, okay, who the people were that created these railroads. And his railroad went all the way over to California. And they hired a lot, 10,000 workers from China and paid them $1 a day in order to finish these railroads. And they completed it in only 4 years. Wow. Each mile of track required 400 rails, and each rail took 10 spikes. So they did it very fast. Very, very fast. And of course, what do railroads do? They spur growth. What does it mean to spur? It creates a lot of growth. So more money, more industrialization. It links the nation. It links the markets. So there's industrial growth. The economy starts growing. And these large railroads would connect to smaller ones. And this new locomotion technology was very important. The railroad is what really changed America, because things could get from one country to the other very, very fast. And also the railroads helped to close the frontier. So to create these railroads, it required more money than most private investors could get on their own. So the federal government is the one that gave these land grants to these railroad companies. Okay, what is a land grant? It's a contract that says this land is yours. And then the railroads would sell land to settlers or other companies to build their businesses there that would help raise money for the railroad. So the government gave a whole lot of these land grants. And so just to be clear, the railroad would get permission from the government to have a piece of land, and then the railroad would sell this land to people, but then the profit that these people made would go straight back to the railroad. And so this land was valuable, and the railroads could sell it, okay, to convince people to move west. And this brought a whole lot of people over there. And the building of railroads themselves offered further encouragement, as settlers no longer had to migrate the entire distance on their own. They could take the train over there. And because people moved to the west, it helped to close the frontier. Basically, because of the railroads, now all of this land here belongs to America. And we just looked at that in chapter 2 with how they treated the Indians and everything else that happened around that time. So again, to review, let's write it down so it's very clear. The government gave railroads money. It changes to English. Oh boy. Okay. Money, which we are going to call land grants. Money, but also land around the railroads, which are the land grants, right? The railroads could sell this land to settlers going west, in order to make enough money to build their railroads. Okay, so the government gave railroad monies, but also land around the railroads. The railroads could sell this land to the settlers going west in order to make money to build their railroads. With all the people going west, this closed the frontier. This means that now all of America was settled. Manifest destiny. Oops. Right? So it took a while, but it did happen. How did the Transcontinental Railroad help unite the nation? So we said it, right? It connected everything, east to west, economically, and even culturally. So there's the answer to that question. Okay. So how did the government grants to build railroads result in large-scale corruption? Uh-oh, we're going to get to corruption in just a little bit. And we have the Credit Mobilier scandal. Remember, well, if you watched the first video, you know that the best way to get this, if you can't understand the text, is to, oops, that didn't work. Let's try it again, guys. Copy. And then we're going to paste. And we're going to put here slide. When you get a slide, you're going to get the short version of it. So the Union Pacific Railroad received government funding to build the Transcontinental Railroad. We saw that already. Construction companies were supposed to bid on doing work for the Union Pacific. To bid means I'm going to kind of ask and see if I have a better opportunity than you. So imagine maybe Mayada is one company and Mateus is a different company. And they're both going to say, hey, we are the best company to build your railroad. But what's the problem? Only one company was ever given contracts, even though their prices were extremely high. And then the rest of the money was kept by politicians and businessmen. So my other company is telling me she can work 10 reais or $10 an hour. Little Mateus's company says, hey, I can do it for 30. That's very expensive. Really, Mayada has a better offer, $10, and it's a good price. But I think I'm going to go with Mateus. Why? Because I'll keep the 10 for the actual work, you know, but the rest of the money, I'm going to put in my pocket or I'm going to give it to politicians. Guess what this is called, guys? Corruption. It's bribery and corruption and money laundering. It's a whole lot of bad things. So it produced widespread anger and led to impression that railroad entrepreneurs were robber barons, people who loot an industry and become rich unethically. So, yeah, this is terrible. So these railroad companies were seen as really bad guys. But if you want to read that, you can read that right there. And then we had the Great Northern Railroads. Not all railroad men were robber barons. James J. Hill was not. He built the Great Northern Railroad from Wisconsin and Minnesota to Washington State without any federal land grants and subsidies. He planned the railroad's route to pass by existing towns in the region and offered low fares to settlers who homesteaded along the route. He also identified products that were in demand in China, including cotton, textile, and flour, and hauled those goods to Washington to ship to Asia. So this is interesting because we had a very successful transcontinental railroad that was not government funded. It was totally privately funded. And Why did robber barons bribe people in Congress? Because they wanted Congress to give them more federal grants. Okay, so read this if you did not understand the Credit Mobilier scandal, or look at some slides. Government loans given to Union. Union Pac hires Credit Mobilier company to build tracks. It overcharges, then bribes key congressmen to keep funds coming. Let's look at our that answers that question, right? Credit Mobilier. Government grants resulted in large-scale corruption because, hey, if the government's giving me free money, it's kind of easy for me to trick the government and trick politicians into giving me more. Okay, so this is how it creates large-scale corruption. And we still have corruption to this day, right? We're almost finished, guys. Look at that. 2 more questions. What advantages do large corporations have over small businesses, and why did workers try to form unions in the 1800s? The review is just going to give us the same questions that we already saw. Uh-oh, I think it locked up. This happens to me sometimes. In which case, we will have to reopen. Let's see. Yeah, sometimes it just dies. So let's log in again. Let's go to US history. We were on chapter 3, lesson 2. Oh, there you go. We were on this final page. Review is going to give us some questions. Why did they give land grants? Because it was expensive to build a railroad. What were the advantages of integrating railroads? It made railroads more efficient. Okay, so we should integrate these railroads, not have them all work separately. This can also create a monopoly, which we will see later. How did railroads help American businesses to expand? Well, more people went out west to work because now we had this railroad there. So it was easy to travel from one part of the country to the other. How did the railroad transform the West? Well, you could move the goods, the manufacturers, from one part of the country to the other. But it also created large-scale corruption because railroads charged high prices for the land they received through federal grants. Okay, so I'm getting this free money, this free land, and now I'm kind of charging whatever I want because only I control this land. So not very good, right, guys? Lesson 3, big business. Well, there's our question. What advantages do large corporations have over small businesses? Well, big businesses were dominating at the time. Factories and distribution facilities. And this was the start of corporations. And I would put that in your notes. Okay, what is a corporation? It's an organization that's owned by many people. Okay, but it's treated like it's one person. So a corporation would be like Google or Amazon or even Disney. It usually has one guy in the top that everybody knows, okay, like Jeff Bezos, or is it Zuckerman from Facebook? But he's really not the only controller of this company. There's many other people that are controlling this company. In fact, everybody loves Steve Jobs, right? But at one point, Steve Jobs fired from Apple. And this was a long time ago. So even though later he got his company back, this proves that even though he created the company, he was fired from his own company because he's not the only man. So this is a very um, this is very young Steve Jobs, right? Before he came back and revolutionized everything with the iPod and the iPad and the MacBook and everything, right? So this is called a corporation. And also, corporations have stockholders. And what is a stock? It's shares, it's a piece of the company. So this is when you go to Wall Street or Bovespa here in Brazil, okay? There's Wall Street right there. And let's see, S&P 500, NYSE. These are all the companies that are being sold, okay? There's the price for Google. It's up by 15.75, but I think this is the price. It's $100 per share. So this is the stock market. So even private citizens like you and me could buy a piece of a company. It's a corporation. So why do companies sell stock? This is their way to raise money. If I don't have enough money, I'm going to say, hey, you, Rodrigo, you can have a piece of my company. And when my company makes money, your piece of money will go up with me. It's not going to be the same amount as me. I'm going to make most of the money. But if my company, let's say, is worth $100 and you bought $1, every time I go up, so let's say I go up by double. So now my company is worth $200. You get $2, I believe. My math is terrible. You have to ask Miss Summer to help you with the math. But if I go up, 100 times 100% is 100. Oh, guys, I'm not the math teacher. Thank God. But you get the concept, right? If my company goes up, I'm going to make most of the money by that percentage, and you're going to make the same percentage, but your total amount is going to be smaller because you only have $1. I had 100 to begin. So if I go up by 10%, which is 110, what's 10% of $1? It's 10 cents. So I have $110 and you have $1.10. So that's kind of how it works. Anyway, let me get away from math and back to history, which I'm much better at. Okay. So before the 1830s, there were very few corporations because entrepreneurs had convinced state legislators to issue them charters. However, soon states began allowing companies to become corporations and issue stock without a charter from the legislature. So basically, this is laissez-faire. What it said is, hey, we don't need to get the government's permission in order to sell stock. Let's just do this because we're a company and we can. So with all this money that the companies were making selling the stock, they can invest in new technology, hire larger workforces, purchase machine, and they achieved economies of scale in which the cost of manufacturing is decreased by producing goods quickly and in large quantities. So the more you can produce, the faster you can produce it, the easier you can produce it, the cheaper the products become. All businesses also had fixed costs. So, by the way, guys, if you're following along, a lot of things to take notes in. I would maybe take notes on that. I write a few notes about that, and a few notes on what is a fixed cost. Okay, it's money that you have to pay even if you're not operating. Maybe you paid a loan, mortgages, taxes. This is a fixed cost. Okay, and an operating costs are what you spend when you are running the company. So these are two vocabularies that I think are important and could maybe be on a quiz later. I don't know because I can't see the quizzes, but I have an idea that things like this will be on a quiz. The difference between a fixed cost and an operating cost. Let's get back. And other operating costs are costs. I'm sorry. So small companies usually have low fixed costs, okay, but high operating costs. So, for example, it's cheaper for me to buy the rent, to rent a building or an office and operate from there. It's cheaper, but sometimes it's more expensive for me to make what I have to make. Why? Because I can't hire that many people, so I have to find one person. I usually don't have transportation that's so good. I can't get the train to bring me my products. I maybe have to in a car, drive somewhere, get the materials. So my operating costs can be higher than my fixed costs. Okay. So because of this, sometimes it's if it becomes too expensive to operate, or if I'm not selling very well, it's better to just shut down. Okay. Big manufacturers, it's the opposite. It's very expensive for them to have a big building. I have one office, but they have the whole building. So imagine how much it costs Agostiniano, for example, to pay the taxes for the school, how much it costs just to buy the school, even when there's no classes, even when it's summer vacation, they still have to pay these things. It's very, very expensive. Okay, but because they can have so many people working, they have so many more resources, it's cheaper to operate. Does that make sense? It's cheaper to operate, so they can keep their operating costs low. And even the wages, okay, are operating costs. So if the sales are low, a big company can stay open, okay, because their operating costs are low. And sometimes this means that workers get paid very little, because if a company is having a very difficult time, they can control a little bit of their operating costs. And this can even mean paying their workers less money. So because of this, big corporations had several advantages. They could produce more goods at a lower cost and could stay open in bad economic times by cutting prices to increase sales. Okay, so it doesn't cost me that much money to make a brigadeiro if I had 20 people making brigadeiros for me. Before, I used to sell my brigadeiros for 10 reais because it was so good. But hey, I'm not selling so many brigadeiros right now, so maybe I'll sell them for 8 reais or 7 reais, or maybe I'll pay my workers less. So this also led eventually to one of the major costs of laissez-faire economics. Small business mainly family owned, that could not compete with large corporations, were forced out of business. So remember, I told you laissez-faire has some good parts to it. It definitely stimulates the economy. It definitely offers jobs to a lot of people, but it can kill small businesses because a small business cannot compete with a big business. Okay, so imagine near your house there's a little per kilo restaurants. It's difficult for this per kilo to stay open. And then if next to the per kilo a McDonald's opens, or Montana Grill, I don't know, something that sells food too, so it's comparable. It's really hard for that small business to compete because McDonald's has a lot of money and it's cheap to make McDonald's burgers. It's expensive to have somebody go there and make all the food fresh every day. So small businesses can lose. Okay? So corporations can produce large quantities of goods. This means that production costs of those goods are lowered. And that answers this question right here, guys. Listen carefully to the video if you didn't understand everything. But like I said, on Tuesday at class time, I will be there to answer any questions that you have. Let's move on. What new business strategies allowed businesses to weaken or eliminate competition? Now we're going to get to the dirty stuff. Okay. How is it that companies killed their competition? Laissez-faire companies benefit consumers because the intense competition led to falling prices. But business leaders didn't like that intense competition had that was forced on them. So cutting prices to beat competition also cut into profits, right? Because if I'm selling you my brigadeiro for 8 reais, I'm making $2 less than when it was 10 or 10 reais, 2 reais less than when it was 10 reais. So I don't like that. Okay. Before I was making 2 extra reais, now I'm making 2 less reais. This does not make me happy. So this is a cost of laissez-faire. There was no regulation governing competition. And competitions were free to make deals with each other to fix prices by organizing pools or agreements to keep prices at a certain level. So what does this mean, guys? Is that, hey, the government's not regulating us. And if I have a brigadeiro company and let's say Sumaya has a brigadeiro company, me and Sumaya can come together and say, look, we will never sell brigadeiros for less than 8 reais. Because come on, I mean, eventually we're going to lose a lot of money. If you make your brigadeiros for 6 reais, people are going to buy more from you, but you're also going to make less profit. I'm going to make less profit. We're both not going to be happy. So let's try to keep the prices a little bit high, not too low, and kind of pretend that we're in competition, but really not. So the American courts and legislator were suspicious of this. They said, hey, I think that there isn't real competition happening here. And I think that companies are fixing prices. Okay, to fix a price is to make a price. That's not real. And the companies that formed pools found that it also had no legal protection. And they couldn't enforce the pool agreements in court. Okay? So as a result, pools generally broke apart whenever one member cut prices to steal market share from another. So that's another problem, guys, is that we're making this informal arrangement, but then just when it seems like me and Sumaya are happy with our 8 reais brigadeiros, I say, you know something? I'm gonna sell my brigadeiros for 5 reais just because I can. And Sumaya is gonna be in big trouble because now everybody's gonna buy my brigadeiros because they're very cheap, and she's gonna lose a lot of business, and maybe she's even gonna have to close her business, and I'm gonna then put my price back up to 8. Okay, and there's no protection for her because it was all done informally. Now we get to Andrew Carnegie. I don't know if any of you have heard of Carnegie Hall in New York. New York, it's a famous place where people play music, and it's named after this famous guy, Andrew Carnegie. And he was a Scottish immigrant, and he started the steel company. Okay. Carnegie bought shares of Iron Steel in factories that made sleeping cars and railroad locomotives. By his early 30s, he quit his job to concentrate on his investments. As part of his business activities, Carnegie often traveled to Europe. On one trip, he met Sir Henry Bessemer, who had invented a new process for making high-quality steel efficiently and cheaply. After meeting Bessemer, Carnegie opened a steel mill in Pittsburgh and began using the Bessemer process. He boasted about how quickly he could produce steel. So the Bessemer process, guys, you should really take a note on this. It is smelting. Okay, there it is. And it's able to, you put iron in there, and it takes all the impurities of the iron, and it's able to make steel. Okay, uh, and it was revolutionary because steel is better to use for construction than iron, because iron has so many um, particles in there that are not, what would be the word? It rusts. Iron rusts. Okay, it has a lot of unclean particles in there. So iron rusts. This is what happens to iron. Okay, this is the problem with iron. And steel does not. Okay, steel does not rot or rust. Steel does not rust. Okay, it can get a little bit, yeah, stainless steel can get a little bit rusty after a while, but for the most part, it doesn't rust. Okay, and it lasts a lot longer than iron. So, yeah, like we have stainless steel, does not stain, corrode, or rust as easily as ordinary steel. Stainless steel has resistance to oxidation and corrosion in many natural and man-made environments. Okay, so this is revolutionary. And Carnegie becomes a very rich man. To make his company more efficient, Carnegie began the vertical integration of the steel industry. Guys, you need to take a note of this. Vertical integration. I know, because, oh my God, I can't take that for some reason. My mouse is being very strange. Oh, there it is. Vertical and horizontal integration. This is important, and I'm sure will be on your test in the future. I'm going to put this after here. Vertical integration. A company owns all the different businesses on which it depends for its operation. And here you have a nice little chart. You can open that and you see what it looks like. Well, that's not right, because that looks very horizontal to me. There's vertical. Okay. So the big company owns the steel mill, which owns the shipping facilities, which own the companies that mine the limestone and quarry. So this is vertical integration. So if I'm going to have my Brigadeiro store or company, I'm going to buy a company that makes cacao. I'm going to buy a company that makes boxes, so I can put my brigadeiros in the boxes. I'm going to buy a company that makes the little cup, the little paper cup that I can put my brigadeiros inside. This is vertical, top down, right? But we're going to see that there's also some horizontal integration. But why is this good? Because, man, I don't have to buy from another company over here to get my stuff. I own everything, so I'm paying zero or nothing to get everything that I want. But now we have Rockefeller. He's the oil guy, okay? Carnegie, steel. Rockefeller, oil. Write that down. These guys, this guy here, he pushed for horizontal integration, which many firms engage in the same type of business into one large corporation. We see a lot of that today. Well, especially in media. Now Disney owns everything, right? I'm going to put that right there. Horizontal integration. And let's look at the little chart here. Oops, that's the chart. So he's buying all the independent steel mills, and I'm going to buy all my competition. So if I'm a very big Brigadeiro company, let's say I have 100 stores in Brazil selling my Brigadeiros, but when I go to a new neighborhood and I see that there's a small Brigadeiro company, I go there and say, hey, why don't you work for us? In fact, I'm going to buy you and you're going to work for us. Okay. And now you're not going to be called Maria's Brigadeiro Company. You're going to be called Mr. Ray's Brigadeiro Company. And you'll be happy because you're going to make money. I'll be happy because I'm going to make money. And that's the end of that story. Okay, so horizontal, you're buying similar companies. Vertical, you're buying all different types of companies that can supply you with what you need. Rockefeller was one of the most famous people to do this with his Standard Oil Company. By 1880, the company controlled about 90% of all the oil refineries in America. When one company achieves control of the entire market, it's called a monopoly. Okay? New businesses and organizations. Many Americans feared monopolies because they thought monopolies could do whatever they want. And really, they can. They can charge whatever price they want on a product because they have no competition. And they also feared that these companies could become so big, they would manipulate politicians and laws and not have any competition. People that supported laissez-faire disagreed. They said, hey, monopolies had to keep prices low because if they didn't keep their prices low, competitors would come with a lower price. And also, if a company was a near monopoly, it wasn't really a monopoly because it was competing on a global scale. Okay, so my oil company, even though I own all the different oil companies in America, it's not really a monopoly because, hey, Europe has oil companies too. So trust, okay, this is important, guys. I'm going to explain it quickly, but if you don't understand it, read it, look it up on Google. Trust was an effort to stop horizontal integration. Okay, states made it illegal for one company to own one stock in another company, but companies found a way to go around these laws. Standard Oil formed the first trust. It was a way of merging businesses in a way that didn't violate the law. A trust is an agreement that allows one person to manage another person's property. The person who managed the property is called a trustee. So I don't have to buy your company. Okay. You can just give me stocks. Okay. And to my trustees, and we'll kind of control your company, but I'm not going to buy it. Okay. So the stockholders receive shares in the trust, which entitle them to a portion of the trust profit. Since the trustees did not own the stock but were merely managing it, they were not violating any laws. The trustees could control a group of companies as if they were one large merged company. So again, to explain this, so I have my big bad Brigadeiro company, and it's illegal now for me to buy different people's companies. I can't buy Sophia's Brigadeiros. I can't buy Sumaya's Brigadeiros. I can't buy Pantufi's Brigadeiros. So instead, I say to you guys, hey, why don't you give me some shares of your company? Okay, and I have a few guys here that will control these shares. And when you make money, we're making money, and we're going to buy enough shares that we're actually going to be more in control of your company than you, but we're not going to buy your company completely. Let's do that. Okay. Remember, a share is a piece of the company. In another way, okay, that these corporations operated were called holding companies. This law allowed corporations set up in New Jersey to own stock in their own business. Many companies immediately used the law to create holding companies. A holding company does not produce anything. Instead, it owns the stock of companies that do produce goods. The holding company manages the companies it owns, effectively merging them into one large company. So now I'm not even going to buy your stock. Okay, I'm going to create an imaginary company called a holding company where all it's going to do is buy your stock and manage. It's going to manage your company, even though technically I'm not buying it. Okay. And then another increase in corporations began when investment bankers began helping create holding companies. Investment banks specialized in helping companies issue stock. Companies could sell large blocks of stock to investment bankers at a discount, and then the bankers would find people to sell the stock to. So if I have stock, instead of me working to find people to buy my stock and sell it for the full price, I'll sell it cheaply to an investment banker. The investment banker is going to find people who will buy my stock. Okay. So this is where we get JP Morgan, Andrew Carnegie. Oh, I'm sorry, JP Morgan, who bought out Andrew Carnegie. He then merged Carnegie Steel with other large companies into an enormous holding company called United States Steel Company that was worth $1.4 billion dollars. And this became the first billion-dollar company in American history. Guys, this is a lot of information. Please, if you have questions, email me or see if I'm on live on Tuesday so I can help you with this. But basically, these are all different ways to connect companies, create these kind of false mergers. One way that you can see this happening sometimes is in movies. When you see the beginning of a movie, it looks like it's like it'll have the big company like Disney, but then Disney owns this studio, But then this other studio doesn't own another studio, but it has a partnership with a third studio. So before you get to the actual movie, you think it's an independent studio, but really it's not, because the independent studio is connected to a bigger studio, which is owned by a very big studio, which then is owned by a merger of these two other companies. It's very complex, but it's a way that companies manage to get very rich. So, one thing you can see here, I like this graphic, the illusion of choice. And you can see that it looks like we have so many companies, but really they're all kind of owned or controlled in some way by these big companies here. So sometimes you'll go to the supermarket and you think one company is competing with another, and it really isn't. Like for example, Fanta and Sprite and Coca-Cola, you think, oh, I prefer Sprite instead of Coca-Cola. Doesn't matter. When you buy Sprite or you buy Coca-Cola or you buy Fanta, all the money's going to the same pocket, which is Coca-Cola. Okay? The true competition is Pepsi and Coke. So just keep that in mind. This all began around this time. And then selling the product. So the creation of giant manufacturing companies pushed retailers to expand in size as well. So now we have more products that people could sell all over the company, all over the United States. And it started advertising companies, which began creating large ads instead of old small print. And then retailers were spending 90 million a year to advertise. So this is the beginning of advertisement. Let's see if we have now that we don't have something on advertising. So you see everything's moving kind of quickly when it comes to business here, right? Advertisers attracted readers to the newest retail businesses. One big one was John Wanamaker's, a Philadelphia department store. The Grand Depot, the largest space in the world devoted to retail selling. Department store is a store where you can buy many, many, many different types of items: clothes, refrigerators, furniture. Okay, these are department stores. Today, Macy's is probably the famous one in America. Chain stores also became popular. A chain store is like Americanas. There's many of these stores all over the world. Sorry, all over Brazil. And people that lived in rural areas got mail order catalogs. So Montgomery Ward and Sears were these catalogs, and these catalogs existed even when I was a child. And the magazines would still come, and I believe they still do. And I mean, many of them probably moved online, but this is how people would sell their products. So monopolies were bad for consumers because, hey, it can kill competitive pricing and make costs go up. Now, people that believed differently said no, because we can't make our prices go all the way up because that's going to force competition to come. Vertical and horizontal integration, you should be able to explain that. How did trust and holding companies create unofficial monopolies? Trust let the owners of one company secretly control another company without buying it. Holding companies allowed a corporation to manage many companies by purchasing their stock. Um, Identify a way that a corporation today could use a similar tactic to weaken competition. Big retailers can achieve horizontal integration by taking over failing retail stores. So a big company will buy a company that's maybe not doing so well. What advantage do large corporations have? They have a lot of money from stock. to build huge factories. What new business strategies allowed businesses to weaken or eliminate competition? Big business utilizes two types of integration to lower costs and new organization styles to reduce competition. And we're almost finished, guys. Lesson 4. Why did workers try to form unions in the late 1800s? So we're seeing that companies are growing, corporations are growing, these owners of these corporations are becoming billionaires or millionaires. But what about the workers? Because remember, we said that a worker is an operating cost, which companies try to keep low. So sometimes workers were not treated so well. Working in factories is very difficult and dangerous. Their jobs were repetitive, they were unhealthy, they would breathe in lint dust and toxic fumes, and there was no regulation in government saying what workers could do. Is this a picture of workers? Look at this. This is not good, but I like to show you even this. Children were made to work, and there was no child labor. 1900s. You see young kids working in factories. There was really no regulation against this. So kids could go out there and work in these factories, and there was nobody that would stop it, right? Because there were no regulations. I don't know if the ebook is going to talk about this. Upton Sinclair is someone who wrote a very famous book about the life of these factory workers, and it's what allowed for some changes to happen, which we're probably going to talk about in a second. So despite these conditions, industrialism led to dramatic rise in the standard of living. Okay, so there was some good news. Average workers' wages, their salary went up 50%. But there became this very big division between the wealthy and the working class, which made the working class very angry. The average industrial worker made 22 cents per hour. Okay, now that sounds crazy, right? So let's see. 22 cents per hour, 1900s. What is that adjusted for inflation, though? So it's about $12.98 per week, okay, or $674 a year. But you have to adjust that for inflation, which I can't do right now because that would take too much time here, guys. I'm sorry. Let's see. $1 1900 it's like $30 now. Okay, so multiply 12 of those into the 30 and you get an idea of how much that was. So it's not too bad. Okay. Deflation, or a rise in the value of money added to tensions. Deflations cause prices to fall, which increased the buying power of workers. Although companies cut wages regularly in the 1800s, prices fell even faster, so that wages were actually still going up in buying power. However, workers resented getting less money. So they said, hey, we want a union. And what is a union going to do? It's going to bargain. It's going to fight for higher salaries and better working conditions. There were two types of unions in the US, which, by the way, should answer this last question right here. We just said they wanted better working conditions and better working conditions and higher salaries. So there are two types of union: crafts and common laborers. Okay, crafts, mechanics, iron, moldings, stone cutters, and common laborers are the ones that just had fewer skills. There were opposition to unions, of course. Okay, and I'm sorry. There were up to 30 national trade unions in the United States. Here are some of the more famous ones. There was opposition to unions. Okay, employees often had to negotiate with trade unions because the unions represented workers whose skills they needed, but they thought unions as conspiracies that interfered with property rights. They definitely didn't like industrial unions, which united all workers in a particular industry. So how could we stop workers from joining unions? First, they would have them sign a contract saying, I will not do one or join one. Sometimes they would hire a detective. When workers tried to organize a strike, they were fired or placed on a blacklist of troublemakers, and they would put a list with your name on it and spread it to other companies. Also, companies would use lockdowns to break up existing unions. They locked workers out of the property and refused to pay them. But all these efforts to break the unions often succeeded because there were no laws giving workers the right to form unions. Okay, government didn't really have a policy towards unions because unions did not reflect laissez-faire economics. So instead, the government stayed out of these disputes and said, hey, I don't know what's going on. So a lot of these unions could be broken up and a lot of people could be kicked out of the unions. Sorry, I lost my place here. Yes, so the government's relationship, it was always more towards businesses, and it impeded the development of unions. Courts frequently ruled that strikes were conspiracies against trade, against the economy, and a lot of union laborers and leaders were put to jail. And sometimes federal troops and state militias were sent to break up the strikes. Why was the government so against the unions? It wasn't just based on economics, guys, but also because a lot of unions were connected to the ideas of Karl Marx, okay, Marxism, which was very powerful in Europe. And Marx was against capitalism, okay? And he had this idea of a class struggle between the workers and the owners, and this idea that the workers had to have a revolution in order to take control of the factories and overthrow the government. So the American government was like, we don't want this. And you'll find that to this day, this is a big, scary thing for Americans. Anything that smells like socialism, they do not want. Okay? And many laborers uh, union leaders, they supported Marx or they agreed with him, but many of them did not support anarchism. And anarchism is this idea that society does not need a government. Next year, you can have government class with me and we can talk about that. Anarchists killed government officials, they set bombs all over Europe, and they really wanted this revolution. And that's very different than what the American laborers wanted. They wanted their rights, even though they also agreed with Karl Marx. And yeah, how were the working conditions? They were dangerous, unhealthy. So this is why workers started this union or these unions. And what made it difficult for these union workers to create large industrial unions? They rarely succeeded because big corporations and government would stand in their way. So, how did they organize? One, strikes. What is a strike? Is when you do not go to work for whatever reason. You have a worker strike. Look at that. So you hold some signs and say, we are not going to work. We are not going to work unless we get what we want, more money, better conditions, etc. So a strike here happened with the railroads. Now, this is a big problem, right? Because the railroad went across the country and it made the country run. So if these people did not go to work, 80,000 of them, it affected 2/3 of the nation's railways. And these strikers also smashed equipment, they tore up the tracks, it blocked rail service, there were gun battles. President Hayes said it was an insurrection. The people were trying to take over the government. He sent federal troops to stop all of this. It took 12 days for police to restore order. More than 100 people died by the time the strike ended, but more than 10 million in railroad property had been destroyed. And this, of course, made Americans think that, hey, if more workers organize, this could be dangerous. So the Knights of Labor was started. Okay, the Knights of Labor was founded in 1869. It said, hey, let's try using boycotts instead of strike. Or arbitration, which is when we use a third person, a third party between the employee and the workers to reach an agreement. And also, they accepted women and African Americans, and they asked for some very clear things: an 8-hour workday, equal pay for women, no child labor, and worker-owned factories. So this is the Knights of Labor. If I were you guys, I would take some notes on that. I would also take a note here on the Haymarket Riot, which, if you want to know what that is, again, I suggest you go on Google. I don't know why that opened. And you can look at that slide. It was a violent confrontation between police and labor protesters in Chicago, in Haymarket Square. The action began on May 3rd, 1886, when one person was killed and several injured during one of their protests. So here we go. You have a lot on the Haymarket riots, and it gave unions a bad reputation again. The Homestead and Pullman strikes. Again, let's look at that and see exactly what that is. There's the Homestead Steel Strike. Near Pittsburgh, PA, strike against Carnegie U.S. Steel. Battle against Pinkerton. Strike unsuccessful. It breaks the labor movement. So again, Carnegie reduced wages. Union and Guards battle. 10 dead sets back for the Union. Pullman strike. Cut workers pay 25%. Eugene V. Debs called on all U.S. railroad workers to refuse to handle Pullman cars. Groveland, Cleveland called out federal troops and ended the strike. Debs was jailed. So again, bad news for the unions because it made them look like crazy people. Okay. Good news is that unions still exist, but they kind of learn how to be a little bit more relaxed, let's say. And that's the question. How are new industrial unions different from older trade unions? Okay. Because that is what really stopped these unions from forming, is that they were too violent and it hurt the reputation of the unions. Workers often share the same complaints about wages and working hours, but unions use different ways to improve workers' lives. Trade unions stayed the most common type of labor organization, but unskilled workers were not represented. So we needed new types of unions, and that's where we get the AFL. The American Federation of Labor was the main labor union. Okay. It was promoting the interest of skilled workers. You have Samuel Gompers. He was the first president. I would write his name down because he does show up later in U.S. history tests. Okay. He wanted to keep it simple. He wanted to focus on wages, working hours, working conditions. And he sometimes used strikes, but he preferred to negotiate. He wanted to make companies recognize unions and agree to collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is let's have a discussion together to find out what is the best price. Second, it pushed for closed shops. This means companies could hire only union members, okay? And third, it wanted an 8-hour workday. And it became the biggest union at the time with 500,000 members. The other unions, so guys, I would write this: AFL, IWW. I probably will be on your quizzes and tests. But a group of labor radicals created the Industrial Workers of the World. Many of these laborers were socialist. They did not want to say there was a difference between skilled and unskilled workers. They were in favor of using strikes, and they were able to have a huge strike of 25,000 textile workers to protest wage cuts. The company reversed the wage cuts after 10 weeks. That was their biggest win, but they also had a lot of failure in strikes. And because of their philosophy that was more socialist and wasn't as organized as Gompers, their union was not as popular. Okay. And then there were other, types of labor disputes, and women. It was women. Okay. The type of jobs women did outside the home showed society's idea of what constituted women's work. About 1/3 of women earned as domestic servants. Another third were teachers, nurses, and sales clerks. The other third were in the garment and food processing industry. Women were paid less than men, even when they did the same job, because it was assumed that women had a man helping to support her, and that a man needed higher wages in order to support a family. And a lot of unions did not allow women. One of the most famous labor leaders of the era was Mary Harris Jones, who was known as Mother Jones. And this magazine still exists today, this publication. It's a union magazine, okay? Jones worked as a labor organizer for the Knights of Labor before helping organize mine workers. She was a very good public speaker, an organizer. And then later, the Jewish and Italian immigrants wanted to find their own union, okay, in the clothing business. It represented men and women in the clothing industry. So if you read on, you have the women's trade union. You see that unions started to grow, and not just for men, but for men and women, and later even for blacks and other groups of people. Why did women want to form their own union? Because the trade unions excluded uh, women. Okay, what is the difference between a closed shop and a lockout? Closed shop is a business that hires only union workers. A lockout occurs when a business refuses to hire union workers. An injunction is a court order. So if I give you an injunction, it means you have to go to court. Sometimes if you're having a strike, the federal or the state court doesn't like it, boom, you have to go to court because your strike is illegal. What are some incidents of labor unrest, violence, government intervention, militia, government intervention? Why did these workers want the unions? Better wages, better conditions. And women, why did women want to form unions? They were paid less. They were thought to only be able to do women's work and not everybody else's work, men's work too, right? And a lot of unions did not allow women. And how were new industrial unions different from older trade unions? Trade unions only kind of worked with skilled white male workers. Industrial unions reached out to unskilled workers and sometimes allowed women and African Americans to join, Black Americans. So this is the difference, okay? The trade unions for skilled laborers like electricians, people that knew how to do something that you have to kind of go to school to learn. In unskilled labor is like a janitor, maybe, somebody, it doesn't take that much to be able to learn what to do. But the industrial union said, hey, we need to protect these people also. So guys, that gets to these questions. So if you paid attention, you'll have the answer to all these questions. But let's get to the second part, okay? Here, you have to search for some of these online, okay, in order to get them. And how do you do that? So you take parts of the question and go on Google and try to find. For example, in the late 1800s, the federal government opened the Oklahoma Indian Territory to settlers who became known as the. So then you have to kind of do a little bit of research, kind of like with the document assignment. So what were settlers to Oklahoma called? And then you will get your answer, okay? And it's right there, okay? And then the second question, what is another name for Sooners? Sorry. Well, it's a boomer, okay? So you get one free answer right there. But I'm not going to give the answer to all of them. So guys, you need to be able to look up some of these based on the keywords. Workers called in by an employer to replace strikers. Find out what that is, okay? Some of these we just read. AFL, okay? So we just found the answer to that one on the last page. An economic and political philosophy that favors public. Oh, we read about that. It's a guy whose first name begins with M, right? Many poor urban families relied on rather than government aid. So this one you need to find. Some companies of the 1800s set out to gain or complete control of a product or service. I wonder what that is. But I believe it begins with an M. Let me, in here, I'll give you a little bit of help. Begins with an H. Remember the name of that act that allowed people to go in there. Here, if you look online, it just says the Pullman strike involved who did the Pullman strike of 1877 involve? One person was this guy, Eugene V. Debs, and the other is the answer, okay? Workers called by an employee to replace strikers. Okay, so what is an employer called in to replace strikers? You're going to get your answer. Here we saw, right? We just read about the AFL. It was on page 7. Whoops, sorry, page 6. So his name is somewhere there. Well, is that his name? I don't know. And yeah, we know who this guy is, right? He has a big beard from Europe. Think red. Many poor urban families in the 1800s relied on, put that on Google. I think you'll find your answer. And that's it, guys. Okay, so that was a lot of information, but I'm glad that you hung with it. I will be here on Tuesday and be able to answer some of your questions if you have any. I will make one more video, which will probably be a little bit shorter, letting you know where all your required and suggested notes will be. Okay? So I will talk to you guys on Tuesday. Let me go back to my page here. It's going to look very strange. And I will, how do I do that? Let's see.